Cool. So, hi, Andy. Let's try it again. Hi, Andy.
Hey, Tyler.
Awesome. Thanks for joining me. I'm excited about this. This is going to be fun.
Yeah.
So let's just dive right in. Here's the thing. I don't know how to run interviews. You're actually the expert here. You're the podcaster. I just have conversations with people. So so that's what we're going to do, and we're going to see what happens. But why don't you give us a quick explanation? What is it that your podcast is, the WinterFaith Podcast? What is that?
Yeah, so my idea, probably 3 years ago, I started what has now become something I reference all the time in conversations, the WinterFaith Podcast. But I think like you, it was kind of a place to just have conversations. It has kind of changed over the years into a place that I've done actually over 50 interviews, sometimes with people I know, sometimes people that I've known for years, and then, just sometimes just like a random person that I'm curious about their story.
Yeah.
But really, the WinterFaith Podcast, I say it's about a place to create conversations to promote emotional and spiritual growth through conversations. And I kind of talk about spiritual growth being from a person of deep faith to a person of apathy towards faith and everything in between. I don't think the opposite of faith is doubt or disbelief, but it's actually a place of apathy. And so I think that everybody has times in their life where they go through these traumatic experiences, some more than others, but where we kind of deconstruct our faith when we question, what I believe. There's other fancy words for that I learned in theology. But I just, just this idea of like, hey, I don't have the same faith when I was, 5 years old as I do when I'm 15, as I do when I'm 35 or 45, 55, 65. I think our faith is always evolving and changing. And I just think there's moments or maybe even full seasons where, we feel like God is distant. And so my idea was winter faith. Like we have winter seasons. Some people maybe call them like a desert period. But just times in our life where we're like, where is God? What is God up to? Is there a God? And I think all those questions are great and good. And we can go somewhere. There's a lot of examples in the Bible, even Jesus himself, like goes through, period of temptation. But I do think some people, it's like there's just like moments, whereas for me, I would say it's almost like a full season. Like I'm like a winter Christian. Some people are summer Christians. But it's just this idea of like being able to have conversations about really anything that people experience.
Yeah, well, I love that. If only there were an opportunity for people to relate to that and experience sort of a season of time where there's a lot of questioning and a lot of doubt and a lot of uncertainty. I just wish that was relevant nowadays.
Right. No kidding. So the season that we're in of like a pandemic, of social unrest, like going through a lot in our country, there's a lot of questions and people are wondering, people have a lot of opinions. I get various feedback of people and what they think about just my, I guess, ideas and theology. And sometimes they're welcome. Sometimes, people want to ignore the tough things.
Well, that never happens either.
So,
yeah. Well, so you mentioned your theology, and you and I, we met probably a few years back. I actually been friends with your wife for a number of years, since college and even before that. And so we met just a few years ago, but our stories actually intertwine pretty interestingly, I went to seminary in the city of Memphis. I guess I was there between the years 2010, 2015, somewhere around there. And you were actually also in Memphis in seminary, somewhere overlapping that time period. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I was there basically from like 2008 to 2015. So yeah, we definitely overlap.
Yeah. And of course, we didn't know each other at all then. You know, we were at different schools in Memphis, but we were definitely there. So tell me a little bit about your story of going to seminary, going to Memphis from what was it, Wisconsin is where you're from? Because
Right.
that makes sense to go from Wisconsin to Tennessee.
Right.
So like, what is that story? What kind of brought you to where you are today, doing the podcast and just wanting to have these conversations?
Yeah, like I've always thought of myself as a minister, but wanting to be a minister that is not in a church.
Okay.
I think initially I thought I would end up working for a church, but then I think the more I got into like what I believed theologically about caring for people that didn't go to church, and whether is for kind of like this idea of like what my mission is with the skills that God has given me. I worked at a lot of non-church jobs with a few church jobs in between, but I always felt this idea of like connecting to people who really are trying to understand God, but don't understand it through like a traditional church
Yeah.
setting.
So sort of like being, people who want to experience faith, but maybe aren't doing it in the normal church setting.
Yeah, a lot of times people are asking questions that maybe aren't welcomed in church, and I
Mm.
feel like that should be the place that we welcome hard questions about God. And like if I look at the Bible, there seem to always be people that question God, and God was open to that. So yeah, but my personal story, just starting in Wisconsin, like never going to a Christian school, always being in public school, and then going to eventually seminary in Memphis was a big change of like being around people who didn't believe and I didn't go to church with, to kind of only being in school with people that were going to be working for
Right.
churches. That was a big change, but I really enjoyed, I think I had a foundation that was based on like practice and theology. And
Yeah.
then I was able to, study and learn more why I believe what I believe in. And I was always welcomed at my school to like ask questions. I went to Harding School of Theology
Okay.
and in Memphis, and yeah, always encouraged to keep learning and keep discovering and keep thinking about what I've thought about God. I was really learning a lot about just like the suffering and the injustice, and I really
Mm.
connected with that being in the city of Memphis, just with all the civil rights history. So I
Right.
really enjoyed being in Memphis for seminary, and then I ended up working as a hospital chaplain in the city of Memphis downtown, and that was again just seeing the suffering in the world, and that always brought about questions for me that
Yes.
I think I have answers for, but I do think that that's just been an interest. Like I want to know why people are hurting, why people are in pain, and whether it's like physically, emotionally, spiritually, and then help people kind of rebuild their faith. And
Yeah.
a lot of that is not something people want to do. Like being a chaplain at a hospital or working at hospice, that's not something, or talking about like denial and grief. Like it's not something a lot of people like talking about, but for me those are like the only things I want to talk about sometimes.
Well,
So
yeah.
I found this jobs at hospitals. I worked at a hospital here, and then now I'm working at a homeless shelter, and so there's a lot of pain there every single day, and
Yeah.
it can get overwhelming. But I do know people, and I haven't experienced this a lot on my show, but people that are really willing to go to some deep hard
Mm.
places, and when you see people come out of like anxiety, depression, poverty, divorce,
Yeah.
addiction, you really have a stronger faith.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I want people to have a stronger faith that's able to deal with the difficult questions and conversations.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it makes me think of, I was actually, um, I got into coaching. Had a 10 year, 10 years doing youth ministry, working in the churches, um, and where you really didn't, you weren't really drawn to working in churches. I, was drawn to that. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but what was interesting for me was that it really was, it's a difficult place to work. It's interesting that you say, you really are drawn to, and you really enjoy working in these difficult places, like, as a chaplain, hospice, these places that a lot of people in ministry are like, heck no, like that is way too much. Um, but it,
I found that fascinating when I would meet ministers that were like, "Oh, I don't do I don't do hospital visits," or like, and
yeah.
I'm like, I feel like that's like the only place we should be sometimes. I don't know.
Well, but
Fascinating.
what's interesting is that, like, I maybe the thought is that it's it's so difficult to do that work and stay like a sane, healthy person.
Mm.
But the funny thing is, I wasn't a sane, healthy person working in church,
Sure.
right? Like, I
Yeah.
was in the quote easy part, and it was still just kicking my butt. And after 10 years, it just chewed me up and spit me out, and I burnt out, and I was just a wreck, and hit rock bottom. Both you and I have experience of going through being in recovery fellowships,
Mhm.
just because that's that's where we needed to be to get our lives together. Um,
Right.
and yeah, it's interesting that you said that in certain contexts, it's these really um, big conversations, these really important things to talk about. Um, like, to me, what I got into coaching to do was, I realized that through my experience in ministry and then my experience in recovery, what I came to realize is that I actually do crave to have those really deep conversations. Um, like, I'm actually not interested at all in the surface level stuff. I, I I really only want to talk about the really meaningful things of life. Um, and that's what I'm hearing you saying also, that you started this podcast because you really wanted to have these meaningful conversations. I started, I got into coaching because I wanted to help people really be present with themselves, and essentially wake up. I sort of have this phrase that I didn't get into coaching to help people run a better meeting. I got into coaching to help people be the type of person they want to be going into that meeting. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I do think I want you, to share your insight, but this idea of like holding space for people within themselves to kind of
Right.
figure out what's going inside, because what's going on the inside, because our world that we live in wants to rush through everything. I want to rush through everything. And when I'm able to stop and sit, and you've been a big teacher for me of stopping and sitting and having space for myself
Mm.
to process whatever I'm feeling or thinking, that really, that's the kind of stuff like I don't take a lot of time, I feel like, to do that on my show, like, or do it professionally, but that's something that I feel like, oh, I need to do this more.
Hmm.
So what does that mean, just to ask you, like, what does it mean to create space for others to hold space for themselves?
Yeah, it's holding space is like, that can be kind of like a buzzword, but I really don't know any other. But it describes it perfectly. Is um, the way I think of it is, my goal is to be present with everything, to just be present in the moment. So I'm not living in the past, or I'm not living in the future. I'm actually experiencing what is happening right now, which is the only thing that we actually can experience. Right, the past is it's in the past. The future hasn't happened yet. The only thing that is real is the present. And so I want to be present for my life. The trick, or the struggle with that is that it's really hard for me to be present if someone isn't almost mirroring for me what presence is. And so I need another person to be present with me, to hold space for me to be present within. And I want to do that for others. I want to hold space for you and be present with you. And by doing that, you will actually be able to sort of slow down and be present with yourself. Right? Yeah.
And it's so hard being present. I mean, I think when I'm doing my podcast, I really try to be present. I think I am good at that. But then you have other people in your life. For me, this is kind of interesting. So I've had, a lot of people in my life that I'm close to and have good friendships with, and a lot of them have been on the podcast, not all of them. But then I'll have people be like, man, you're really present during that podcast. You listen well on that podcast. Why can't you listen better outside of the podcast? So you almost get like critiqued within myself of that idea of being present. And it's such a challenge to say, I'm gonna have this place for you too. I'm gonna be present. I'm gonna listen well. I'm gonna hold space for you. For me, it's like I'm gonna be authentic. And it's almost like, how do you be authentic in being a show that's authentic? Because I do know, like, even now, it's somewhat of a show performance, but it's you try to be yourself as much as possible, and it's really a fascinating experience that I never thought about.
I love that you brought up the show performance. Like this morning, literally, I was on the phone with a friend this morning, and he was like, "So what do you have going on today?" I said, "Well, I'm recording this conversation with someone, and I actually need to get off the phone and sort of prepare for that." And I explained to him, I was like, "Really, the preparation for this conversation is to just sit down and like meditate and realize that it's not a performance. Because if I come into this conversation with you, Andy, thinking, okay, we need to have a really good conversation, then it's not going to be good at all." But if we're just sitting here talking the way that we do any other time we're talking, that's when we'll have compelling things to say, because it's more present, right? We're actually here with each other just talking, and it's not I hope we say something really good so that our listeners will think we're impressive.
Yeah. Well, so just what are the things that you feel like people need when they come to, for coaching? Is there something, like, I know it's different for everybody, but is there something that really, I'm curious, like, what are the things you think people need just from your experience, professional coaching?
I think you and I have both experienced the benefit of sort of working through a system of development. We've sort of have experience with the 12 steps, but they're all, even being in churches and going through seminary, sort of just discipleship processes, all of these things. And I think the goal of all of those is for us to realize or become aware of all of the fear and anger and resentments that are going around within me, that all of these emotions that I'm experiencing, and if I'm not aware that I'm experiencing them, they are actually running the show. They're the ones driving the car, and I'm, in the back seat having no idea what's going on. Whereas if I'm aware of them, I can hold them at a distance. Sort of the ancient wisdom talked about detachment from things, and that detachment isn't a stoicism where I don't feel anything and I rid myself of emotion. That's not the ancient understanding, or at least the ancient Judeo-Christian understanding of detachment. It's no, my emotions belong. I feel them, I know them, I experience them, but I can hold them at arm's length and say, okay, that's fear. I'm feeling fear. But I don't have to let it drive my life. I don't have to react to the fear. I can instead of reacting to it, I can respond to it. So all that to say, whenever I'm coaching someone, what I'm hoping that they're doing is they are becoming aware of these things that are affecting their behavior or driving their decisions, and they may not even realize it. And so I'm holding space for someone. I'm mirroring what I'm seeing. I'm saying, hey, you are, you've been having this difficulty with procrastination, and you're talking about it and you're explaining to me what happens. And this is what I'm hearing. I'm hearing there's a lot of fear behind this thing that you're putting off again and again and again. And by holding that space and mirroring that and saying, I'm sensing a lot of fear. Are you feeling that? They might all of a sudden say, oh my gosh, you're right. I had no idea how scared I was of this thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is that, okay, so kind of what I hear is like the emotional intelligence piece.
I think that's a big part of it.
You would use, but I think that's similar for me, because I do think that churches and Christians in general don't take time for like emotions. We really want the correct beliefs more than like the correct understanding of emotions.
Yeah.
And I've somebody teach me or say this on my show, that you can't be like emotionally mature, or you can't be like a mature Christian if you're emotionally immature. And right. I definitely grew up with that idea. And I do think we're in a world that like talks about self-care, talks about emotional intelligence a lot more than when we were growing up. But even in seminary, I don't think that we talked about that stuff very much either.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah, that's definitely a connecting point. And I'm wondering what theology and churches and faith has to say in terms of like the rise of emotional intelligence.
Yeah, it's interesting. One ancient, I guess, he was a desert mystic back in the 3rd century, maybe even 2nd century. I don't know. His name was Evagrius of Pontus, or Evagrius Ponticus, something like that. He was an Egyptian desert monk. And something that is really fascinating about him is he sort of had this entire system of thought when it came to emotions. But he didn't actually describe them as emotions. He described them as thoughts. And this is sort of pretty consistent with the ancient understanding of how humans were made, is that our thoughts and our emotions were very much, tied together. And so if I have the thought of fear, that's the emotion of fear. If I have the thought or emotion of anger, but what Evagrius, the way he described them is that these thoughts were, he actually described them as spirits coming in. And so some people have taken that as that, these are demons infiltrating him. I don't think that's exactly what Evagrius was saying. I think it was mostly just like these almost neutral thoughts that would sort of bombard the person's mind. And then you had the opportunity to react to these thoughts and basically do what they told you to do, like fear, anger, lust, pride. Or you could respond to them and say, okay, there's this thought that is, coming into my mind, but I'm not going to listen to it. I'm going to do something else. Like, that doesn't deny it, but it also doesn't demonize it, or it, I don't know where I was going with that, but it's just interesting.
Well, it's encouraging that even, back in the 3rd century, like we're already talking about what do our feelings have to do with our faith?
Well, so it's interesting. I know we were talking a while back, and you mentioned something about Genesis 1 Christians and Genesis 3 Christians. Like,
Yeah,
talk about that, because I feel like that's sort of,
I think
you're
it's
kind of getting on that point.
Yeah, like, we want to kind of name humanity as like evil or bad a lot of times. I've talked about the influence of like Calvinism, some people would say like Reformed theology, but yeah, Calvinism really says that we can't be like, we need to understand that we are really, bad people that only can be saved because of Jesus. And I want to push back on that and say, like, we were made in the image of God. We were made to be very good. Like, there is, there are problems in our world, and humanity has been a part of creating those problems, but still at the very nature of who we are
Yeah.
is created in the image of God. And so I get really frustrated when there's large churches and large teachings out there that want to talk about kind of like the fall of humanity, the evil of humanity, and just how depraved we are as humans because of the fall. And I
Hmm.
just think that has done so much harm because we think so little of ourselves, and in
Yeah.
turn little of other people along with ourselves. And I think it doesn't give much credit to God if, in Genesis 1 God created us in the image of God, and then we turn around a few verses later and
I think you went out there right when you were about to say
no,
something good.
man, I even moved all this stuff over here. Oh, shoot, I don't know if
So,
it's this time. It's
yeah, it
this
might be
time.
you, it might be me. But like what you're saying is like Genesis 1, God creates everyone, and God says everyone is good in Genesis chapter 1. And then Genesis chapter 3, there's the story of the fall of humanity, and how humans screw it all up, and they're bad and all of that. And you're saying that like that sort of describes the the two perspectives of humanity,
Yeah,
right?
it seems like, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting. I would actually say that you're skipping a chapter.
That's true.
There's Genesis 2 in the middle.
Yeah.
And I would say that um, the if you bring the two together of Genesis 1, where God creates humanity and they're good, and then Genesis 3, where humanity falls and fails, in the middle of that is Genesis chapter 2, where God says to the man, hey, you are it is not good for you to be alone, you need someone else. Which I think is really interesting, that God looks at the person that he created and says, nope, you need something else. You are not entirely uh, complete on your own.
Hmm.
You actually are incomplete by yourself. And so this idea of, well, God created us good, and I'm just perfectly fine as is. Like, well, no, actually you're not. You actually need others. You are dependent on others. Um, you are not self-sufficient.
Hmm.
And so Genesis 2 actually suggests that I am flawed, and that's perfectly okay, because I can fill in the gaps that are inherent within me by having the support of others,
Mm.
right? I think um, it's when I move away from that and think that I'm self-sufficient. That's where I get into the Genesis 3, where I start messing things up,
Hmm. Hmm.
right?
Yeah, like Genesis 3 could be, going with that idea of like community and needing others. It's like Genesis 3 is when you have others with you, but you're still ignoring those people. And do see the value of community. Um, yeah, I think that is true. I think that the need for a community to see yourself and understand yourself is huge, because I don't think I would understand a lot about myself if it wasn't for other people in my life.
Right. Like we need others to hold space for us. That's how it works.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then when there's people who kind of, man, I just think about my work currently and how many of the clients I work with are so isolated.
Mm,
It's their fault or others, or just where they've, just the family they grew up in, the life that they've been given compared to the life I've been given. It's like some people don't have this great history of community and family. And you do see when we try to live life on our own, and even the theology that teaches like all you need is you and God. I think both of us would really think that's not the way God designed it.
right.
Um, and so you do see the effects of when you take community away from people and you're just living in isolation, how devastating that is for people.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that is one of the hardest things for me to remember and for me to learn is that, um, this idea that I have to seem, you know, strong, independent, capable. Well, again, it goes back to this idea of, if we want this to be a really interesting conversation, then we can't try to perform well. We can't try to
Mhm,
seem impressive.
mhm.
The most impressive thing we can do uh, is to be vulnerable and to show our quote weaknesses.
Mhm.
Brene Brown is sort of onto something there.
Yeah, what do you think of Brene Brown's work? That's a good conversation too.
It's interesting. I love her work. I don't like her writing for
Or the
whatever reason. For
ideas
whatever
behind.
reason, I don't like her. Like I've tried to read her books, and they just don't do it for me. But I will
Okay.
listen to anything that any of her speaking. I just eat it up. I love it. So it's whatever. I don't know why, but I can't get behind her writing, but I love her actual work.
Yeah. What do you think has made her so popular right now, or the past, since her TED Talk? I think it was like 2012.
Yeah, I think I think she is speaking to people's souls, if I could put it that way.
Hmm.
That there's something that people have a deep desire to hear because they know it to be true. They know that um, concealing themselves, that hiding from others, that trying to look strong and powerful and in control just doesn't work. It's a bankrupt system. And they want to believe, because they somewhere know it to be true, that if I can be honest and vulnerable with something, that's where the life is. And so when she articulates that in a really compelling way, people just latch onto it because they say, "Finally, that's what it feels like is true. Thank you for saying it." Um, and I think that she just has been able to articulate what people want to believe is true.
Hmm. It's amazing to me that we have everything that we can do with movies and TV and just all the advancements in making movies. And there was a stretch when she released like an hour special, and she's not like a stand-up comedian, she's a
Right.
gifted speaker, but she does a Netflix special, and it's like the number one thing on Netflix, and all it is her talking about vulnerability and shame.
Right. Right.
It is really interesting. Like, I think that does say something about our world, how much we long for just authentic people willing to say things that are true. Like you said, speaking of the soul, like this idea of like, hey, have you ever thought about the fact that you're not good enough? Do you get stressed by not being a good enough mom, by not being a good enough dad, by, your performance at work or the messages in your head, and how much that relates to so many people? And I do think it probably relates to some people more than others, but I think for most of us, if we're able to admit this, like for myself, like for most of my life, I felt like I was not good enough at anything.
Right.
And then the feedback that I get from people, if I talk to people from like high school or college or even, current day, some of the critique on myself is that I come across as arrogant, which is so not how I feel. Like, I don't feel like I'm better than anyone, but a lot of times the feedback that I've received sometimes has been that I'm like standoffish. And so that's a terrible feedback for trying to, I don't think that's everybody in my life, but that's terrible feedback if you're trying to start a podcast and people think you're arrogant
Yeah.
and full of yourself, which I know many podcasts that's the critique of those people. Much more bigger following than me. But I do think that it's just amazing that she's been able to resonate with so many people.
Yeah.
And even to the point of being on the largest platform ever with Netflix. She even had a role in like a sitcom movie with Amy Poehler. I don't know if you saw some movie that she did where Amy Poehler and her group of friends see Brene Brown at a restaurant, and they are just like starstruck, like, "Oh, that's Brene Brown. We have to go over." And
That's awesome.
I think she only had like one line in the movie, and she's like, "Well, one of the things I try to teach people is about boundaries." And then they kind of just walk off the set or walk from the.
Awesome.
But it's just funny that even in that world, like she's like a celebrity. It's it's
Yeah.
it's really fascinating to me.
Again, for me, for coaching, um, and just in general, I can't be vulnerable if there's not another person there to be vulnerable to, right?
Yeah, right.
Vulnerability necessitates another person, um,
Right.
which is interesting that if the goal is vulnerability, um, then that implies that we have to have others to do it. And so I have to have someone who I can, uh, be present with, and I can be vulnerable to. And I want to hold space for others so that they can practice the vulnerability and the honesty. And the whole purpose of it is so that I can actually be honest with myself, so that I can actually know what's going on, within me. It's when I'm vulnerable with someone else, when I say things out loud, sometimes I'm hearing it for the first time, even though it's been in my head for a long time. When I say it out loud to another person, it's like, oh, well, that was there. Who knew that? It's like, that's why I have to say things out loud to people. Because sometimes that's the first time that I hear it myself.
Yeah, so saying it out loud is helpful. What about writing it out loud? As in, like, this posting on Facebook business and Instagram.
Yeah.
Is that helpful? Like,
I think it can be.
Okay.
I think, like, for me, journaling is a really helpful practice, but I find that it doesn't really seal the deal until I say it out loud to someone. I can continue to fool myself into thinking that I'm okay, that I'm feeling okay, when really, like, there's still a knot somewhere in there that needs to be loosened. And I can write that out, but it's still, the tension is still there until I say it out loud to someone.
Yeah, journaling is one of those things I talk about and I don't do a lot. And then we've had conversations where you're like, why is it a goal for you to journal if you're never going to do it? why do I keep having these goals if you're not going to do it? And I love that because I feel like you're calling me out. It's on something in a good, positive way of just like, don't set a goal if you're not going to do it. That's
Right.
Goals should be something that you're actually going to do. So if you're just like, and how much of like, well, I'm just supposed to, I feel like that comes a lot from maybe not church, but maybe a lot of church of like, well, I'm just supposed to say the right thing at the right time.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
like, well, it's not helpful if you're not actually going to do it.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Well, and like, isn't that we do that because we don't feel safe, right? We feel like we have to perform.
mm,
We feel like we have to say the right thing so that people will think that we're super holy or something,
mm-hmm.
as opposed to feeling safe to say, yeah, I'm not going to do that.
Right.
It's not going to happen. Even if it is a good idea, it's just not going to happen. And I can feel safe to say that. So that then someone can say to me, okay, that's fine. It might be a good idea to think about doing it, but if you're not going to do it, then that's okay. You're still okay. You're still welcome and accepted and, worthwhile and all of that. Right.
Yeah. Well, I do. I mean, I think all this stuff is really helpful. I hope somebody out there listening gets some of this conversation.
Yeah.
Because I do think that it's so important. Just how even like uncomfortable it is to just like, yeah, just I don't know if it's about being a Christian or being a man or whatever. Like how uncomfortable it is to just be able to have like a conversation and how we're not trying to get answers. I think for me, I'm trying to get answers, I'm trying to get solutions, and that, I'm trying to be proactive, but how a lot of it for me is just like having conversations out loud, talking about what's going on. Like I'm stressed, I'm feeling guilty, I'm feeling anxious, and to have, like you said, and you've done this for me, and hopefully vice versa, is just like, hey, like, yeah, that's how you're feeling. Okay. Um, just how important that is to have community, like we talked about Genesis 2, like having community, um, and just how uncomfortable it can be to just have conversations sometimes. So I hope that's people listening can understand, like, and that can motivate people to do this more.
Yeah. Well, if no one else gets anything out of this conversation, I did. I enjoyed it. So I think that's what really matters. Because it's really just all about us. This is why we did this, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
All right. So Tyler is on. What is your website?
Yeah. So where do we find each other? All right. I am on. Wait. Yeah. Who are you? Where do we find you?
Okay. So Andrew Frazier, the WinterFaith Podcast on Anchor, Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on social media at the WinterFaith Podcast, and me, WinterFaith Andy, on Twitter and Instagram. What about you, Tyler?
I am Tyler Smither, and you can find me at tylersmither.com, or you can find me on Facebook at Tyler Smither Professional Coaching.
Yes, and I love your artwork. It looks just like you. So
my silhouette. It's beautiful. Well, Andy, this has been a blast. Thanks for agreeing to have this conversation with me. It's always a joy.
Absolutely. Thanks.